We'll give it another minute or so and make sure.
Hi, Susan Bristow.
Hi, Dr. Lofton. How are you?
Oh, hey, Barbara, I didn't realize you were back on.
Yeah, I just came back on. I saw Susan. I forgot to tell Molly and Susan, congratulations on Women of Walton.
Oh, thank you.
Thank
you very
Barbara.
much.
We're in
I have forgotten all about it. I saw it in the somewhere on our website.
You know, I was thinking about it. Somebody asked me the other day how many women were here when I started in 91, and Tom Jensen could probably help me with this, but it was like single digits. Ann Henry, Deb Thomas, and it was a very small community.
Nina Gupta.
Yes, Nina.
She and I came at the same time. Same with Doug Jenkins.
Yeah.
Same year.
How is Nina doing? Has anybody heard?
I have not heard.
Me neither.
No. Well, I'm going to check and make sure we've got all our guests on here, and then
I miss seeing Joanna Newman too.
I
really enjoyed her classes.
Absolutely.
I talk to her from time to time. She's doing good.
Good.
Okay, well, I think we will get started. I can't tell you how happy I am to have so many people gathered on a Friday afternoon. I was probably the only one hoping that it would be bad weather to not be tempted by our pretty days that we had last week. So that all worked out, and I'm very happy. I'd like to begin by thanking Anne O'Leary Kelly and Barbara Lofton for approaching me with this idea. Not just because I think it's a terribly important topic to talk about, but also because after doing 8 lunch and learns a year for about 11 years, I am woefully in need of topic suggestions. So I really appreciate that. And the first people they named when we started brainstorming on who to bring in were Anna and Carrie. And I really appreciate your willingness to join our Walton family today and share your insights with us. And Anna, I want to say a special thank you to you for the way that you just so enthusiastically jumped in to frame up some of the conversations that we could start with, and that helped immensely. So I'm grateful to all of you. I'd like to just do some very brief introductions, and I want to keep them brief. They will not do service to these individuals, but I just want to make sure we save our time for the topics that we have today. But we all know our beloved Barbara Lofton, and I miss seeing you in the hallways every day. Barbara is our assistant dean, and she heads up all things in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and has just been an iconic figure in our Walton College for many years. And we're grateful for you being here today, Barbara. And of course, Anna is, I couldn't even go through all the titles. I mean, I think when we first met, you were just a regular old faculty member like me, and then served as the interim department chair and now an associate dean in Fulbright. And I don't know how many people tug on Anna for her expertise in such a variety of areas. So thank you for joining us. I have not had the pleasure of meeting Carrie in person, but good grief, I've heard so many things about you. And everyone, when they say your name, they just talk about your energy and how compelling you are. And I'm just delighted to meet you virtually today. Carrie serves as the director of our African and African American Studies. She's an associate professor of history. And I actually am going to read your book because my daughter, being from Ethiopia, I was so really compelled by the title of the book, and I look forward to reading that. So our format today is going to be very much a conversational one, and I'll share this screen so that you see our main topics. Hopefully you're seeing that view. We're going to start off with 2 questions. Carrie and Barbara are going to talk about this conversation and why we're having it. Why would this be important? And then Anna will follow up with specifically discussing safe spaces and brave spaces. And then we're going to open it up for Q&A. I've asked them to keep remarks fairly brief because I really want each of you on this call to have the chance to ask questions. So that is our primary topic for today. And I'm going to start by imposing on Carrie for sharing her thoughts on our first question. Why is the conversation about race, diversity, inclusion, and classroom spaces an important one?
Thank you so very much. It's my distinct pleasure to be back at Walton. I think I gave a couple of talks over here last year, about 3 or 4 or so, and I'm always excited to interface with faculty and students who I think are of critical importance when it comes to this issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because Walton, perhaps more than any other, probably other spaces at this university, has an outweighed influence on the kinds of equity that can be made um, going forward. Walton being involved in training students who are going to be leaders in the business world, and given the vast inequities that exist for women, for Black and people of color, I think this is of the utmost. And so that is why I'm particularly uh, that is where the foundation of my ideas about why we must have these kinds of conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and address issues of race. And I would also say we cannot talk about race unless we talk about class and talk about gender as well, because those kinds of thinking and understanding directly impact what the kinds of students we produce and the kinds of outcome in real world society that will happen. So, I think back to, what has prompted so many of these kinds of conversation, especially, in the post George, there was a world before George Floyd and there's a world after George Floyd. And I'm happy that there are so many people who are interested in having this conversation, and particularly business people who are thinking about their curriculum and thinking about these issues, right? To see how moments like that, like the George Floyd incident, were not created by design, and how all of us are implicated in what transpired, and how all of us can make an impact, right? And having these conversation, including it in our curriculum, will certainly, become a way of mitigating those kinds of instances. As a historian, I know that the arc of American history, you know, um, tell these stories over and over of not only those kinds of violence, but the kinds of economic, legislative, political violence that, define the experiences of racialized people um, on a daily basis. And we have to, as professors, have those conversations in our classrooms where we're tracing, the systemic inequalities of how Americans, or how America have come to know and understand itself, right? I know in my profession, for much of its existence, uh, historians have contributed to an understanding that essentially became a part of the fabric and architecture of Jim Crow, right? The lost cause, the reason why you see Southerners waving Confederate flags, historians are implicated in that as well, because they created the kinds of text and understanding that would, be taught in classrooms, that would be consumed by individuals that would provide the scaffolding for the ideas, the intellectual credibility for these kind of ideas, of violent ideas, right? Um, so we have to come to these kinds of, when we look at our present moment, and when we're producing students who are going forward, we have to think about the ways in which, racism and racial inequality have powerfully shaped American history from the very beginning. The kinds of genocide and slavery and the colonization of Native American lands, and the treatment of slaves as property to be mortgaged and to be rationalized in balance sheets, and auctioned and sold and denied absolute freedom, are very much still some of the practices that are still taught in business schools today, right? You know, the very first colonialist in Jamestown, right, who John Rolfe wrote in a letter, who became investment property as soon as, you know, the first 20 and odd Negroes who became investment property as soon as they touched the shores of this, what was an independently owned franchise called America. So if we want to trace the moment where we have inequities, where Black life and Native American life and other lives that we see even in our institution, by the absence of those kinds of people, did not matter. We also have to go back and have conversation about those seemingly innocuous and routine beginnings, right? We have to go back and think about, the moments when African captives were reduced to units of exchange in slave castles, and the kinds of rational processes that enslavers used to maximize profits during the slave trade, right? The kinds of monetary values that was put on Black life in life and in death, because even cadavers came to, own, to take on a price, right? So we have to have those kinds of conversation to give real meaning to what then people, then the kinds of decisions that people then go out to make as training students, who to be future business leaders in corporate entities, whether it's Walmart or Tyson's or McKinsey or Chase Bank or whatever. They're going to be bringing, technocratic management and leadership as consultants, advising managers on how to run companies. You know, you'll students will be entered a system mired in structural inequalities, not the least of which is race, right? So how one understands and approach what they do, and how, they organize it, is very important to whether you will help to reinforce the system, or whether they will serve to disrupt those systems of racial inequity, right? Um, the evolution of modern management, for instance, is usually associated with good old fashioned intelligence and ingenuity, right? The kinds of glorious parade of inventions, but in reality, much more messier than that, right? Capitalism, as we know, it was not just about the free market, it was also built on the backs of slaves who were literally the opposite of free. So if we ruminate on all of these things, we can trace the very crucible um, within which much of what we're studying over here in Walton was birthed, right? And its connections to the kinds of systemic inequality people are bravely attempting to eviscerate, or sometimes half-heartedly trying to feign interest or posture in, right? So having those kinds of conversation in the classroom having students trace those kinds of links between um, those early system that establishes, what we're currently experiencing now, right? To see how the trade in human beings was a generative spark for what we are now seeing, not only um, in terms of individual inequities, but the kinds of global devastation and global inequities that we might see between the global south and the global north, right? And this is stuff that's being studied. Caitlin Rosenthal, for instance, the was a Harvard fellow in business history. Found that the southern plantation owners kept complex and meticulous records that measured the productivity of their slaves, monitoring their profits, often using even more sophisticated methods than manufacturers in the north, right? So these slave owners' practices, such as incentivizing workers and depreciating their worth through the years, are widely used in business management today, right? This history of detailed record keeping on plantation goes back to at least 1750s. You could trace it back to Jamaica, to Barbados, some of the most brutal plantation systems where Black life didn't matter, where the calculation was made that we wouldn't keep people for more than 3 to 7 years. We'll just have them fall dead and get profits and get some more from the slave trade, right? So having those conversations where students can trace those kinds of beginnings and to have a clear-cut connection in terms of the racial inequities that we see in our society today um, is I think paramount. And I think this calls for a fundamental shift in not only how the university is organized, but how our curriculum is organized, and the kinds of new measures that we have to put in place to create students who might go forward to be in positions of decision making that might affect vast amount of people. So I'll stop there for now, and then if you have any
Perfect.
questions, I could take that up.
Thank you for laying the foundation for us. And Barbara, we'd love to hear your thoughts on the same question as well. For our guests that are on the call, we'll be sort of drilling this down into what we can do in an actionable way in the classroom. And if you have questions, I'd love it if you'd just put in the chat that you have a question. You don't have to say what the question is, but just let me know, or you can use the raise hand function, and we'll be turning to Q&A as soon as we hear from Barbara and Anna. So Barbara, we look forward to hearing from you.
So I don't know if you keep up with the statistics of what's going on in our public schools, but in 2014, it was predicted and shown that there were more minorities in our public schools than among our Caucasian group, which means we'll have more minorities coming to our colleges and universities, plus our international students. So by 2044, we're going to see our classrooms shift. But before we get to 2044, as Kareem mentioned, we have people who are going out into the workforce. Our workforce is very diverse, not just by race, but by gender, any of the protected classes. And then we have this other idea that we have to deal with, which is the intersectionality that occurs. So if you're Black and female, or if you're Hispanic and older, or just dealing with an age generation, we have to teach or expose our students to these, what we call difficult conversations about how race, gender, sexuality, age, size, how does that play into what you plan to do for the future? There is no one in this society yet that can work 100% alone. That's not a workforce. You're going to communicate with someone, you're going to see someone, you're going to interface through technology, you will be interacting with people. So it comes down to how do we have these difficult conversations? First of all, as faculty, we kind of get to know who's in the classroom, but to have this conversation, you really must know who's in the classroom. Do you have somebody who's deaf? Do you have somebody who needs to have you turning facing the class and not talk with your back turned? Do you need to be one of those people standing still? You need to find out who's in your classroom and what are their likes and dislikes, even find out what their expectations and fears are. Then secondly, as you want to introduce these difficult conversations, I recommend as a faculty member, you go back and trace the history like Carrie mentioned. So let me just kind of give you an example. Doing I love Black History Month because that's like everything. I wish they did everything during the regular months. So PBS did a special on Driving While Black.
I hopefully show up today.
We generally think of Driving While Black as something that's going on today. Well, Driving While Black actually has a history. And you, as a faculty member, you need to find out what that history is. What has it done to the country? How has it changed things? What does the interstate have to do with it? What is the whole process about Driving While Black? When did it occur? Or let's talk about the Crown Act. Why is it so important? Why do we need to recognize it? What does it have to do with the classroom? When you find out what the Crown Act is, you'll understand. Understanding why people wear I remember when I used to participate in graduation, I wear kente cloth, and people would come up to ask me, what is that? Why do you wear, what does it represent? And I had to go through a whole sermon about the kente cloth and what it represents. But knowing, in these difficult conversations, it's going to be important for you, the faculty member, to say, I don't know what that is right now, but I guarantee you when you come back to class the next time, I'll check. And to give our students assignments associated with all the disparities that are going on in our country. The disparities are not just about race, even though race is a big part of it. But for an example, what did COVID expose to us? That we have rural communities that are inadequate in hospitals, that we have older people who sometimes we ignore and don't take care of, that Black and brown people, and in this region of the state, even our Marshallese were not taken care of properly. So it gives you something to think about. So having students to be able to trace what's all involved in health disparities is something keen for them, especially if you're in a class where you're having to manage this kind of conversation. The other important thing is for students of color, whether you can tell they're students of color or not, or even non-students of color, they would like to see themselves in the curriculum. Right now, I'm sure they don't see themselves in the curriculum. I remember going to an FBC class and a young lady asked me, and we were just talking about diversity issues, and a young lady asked me, she says, whatever happened to the Indians? I'm like, what do you mean, what happened to the Indians? She put two hands up over her head to indicate feathers and did the sign with her mouth. Oh, I said, you mean Native Americans? She said, yes, why did they disappear? I said, they didn't disappear. That was America's way of depicting Native Americans. They were a much more sophisticated society than we think. And then I began to talk about it, but prior to that, I had to bring the class under control because they were just cracking up. So when you think about when minorities are depicted on television, it sometimes is not in a positive manner. I know I can sit down and watch TV, and if it's a crime show and there are minorities on there, I said, guess who the bad people gonna be? Guess who's gonna get killed first? So these are images that we're dealing with. So by having these difficult conversations, we can change some of these images in which our students are dealing with. I remember when Doyle Williams was dean, and we had a first-ranked student who could not find a job. first rate, couldn't find a job, crazy. So he pulled some strings and got him a job with a company, a consulting company, in fact. And the young man was back here in Fayetteville, Arkansas in less than 6 months. He said he was not going to work with older people. He was not going to work with women. And the only thing he wanted to work with were young, up-and-coming white men. Okay, that is not the work environment today. You have to be able to work with all kinds of people. And you have to understand the language that goes with it, both positive and negative. So teaching these kinds of things in the classroom become extremely important. And yes, it is a burden for you to go back and trace the history of some things, but that's the beauty of my office, because we're developing resources that you can use. Now, don't come to me tomorrow because I won't have it tomorrow. But for the fall semester, we're developing resources that can help you have these difficult conversations. And like Carrie gave a lot of the history, extremely important. Knowing who's in your classroom, extremely important. Being able to say what you know and what you don't know, extremely important. Learning what you can say and not say, extremely important. So as you're going through this experience, I'm going to tell you right now, yes, it's going to be difficult. It's not difficult for me. And I have to bring this point out. So I asked one of our senior administrators, I'm not naming the name, but just tell you, senior administrator, I said, you know, when I was going to school, I didn't have a choice to learn about you. And I had to embrace that 100%. Why can't you embrace learning about me and all the other me's that don't exactly look like me, but are classified as minority or recognized by the affirmative action as one of the coveted titles? She said, that's the part of white privilege. We didn't have to. And now we're finding ourselves, I wasn't offended. I knew the answer before she said something. And then the dean had a conversation with me. He said he was appalled by some of the responses he heard in hashtag Black at UARK. I said, I don't know why. I don't know why you're appalled. I say, because we don't teach about minority representation and what happens with them in everyday life. So therefore, people get to say and do whatever it is they want to do. He says, well, I'm appalled that people let them come to school, their parents let them come to school holding these ideas. I say, what they learned at home, what they learned in school, and what they're learning in college is not about minority representation in this country. So it's up to us to change the narrative, to include minority ideas, living, wages, healthcare, marketing, the whole 9 yards. Everything we do in business, we should be seeing people that reflect our minority group in the textbook, or at least in the philosophy and content. And if it's not in the book, we go get it.
Barbara, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I want to make sure we get Anna in on the conversation. And
I'll get back to Ian.
Yes.
So it's important that we do all these things that I've talked about.
Great. Thank you so much, Barbara. I miss, again, seeing you in the building. Look forward to when we're all back. I'm going to share some slides that Anna's developed for us. And thank you so much for transitioning us to talk about the need for safe spaces, brave spaces, and the role they play in these conversations.
Yes, thank you very much. And I prepared some remarks that kind of align with our slides. But before I say anything related to the slides and my topic, I would like to thank you, Dr. Rappert, for the question and for inviting me to be here on this panel. I'm honored to participate with Dr. Banton and Dr. Lofton, both of whom I truly and deeply admire. And yes, Dr. Lofton, what you talked about is a quintessential example of privilege. So with my remarks, so since we are talking about race, let me define my own racial positionality, which is different from my race and self-identity. Living in the United States for about 33 years and teaching the intersections of gender, race, class, and sexual orientation for almost 30 years, I have learned that my racial positionality is white-ish, and I will gladly elaborate on this during the Q&A. My remarks this afternoon pertain to having meaningful conversations on race, just like the ones that Drs. Banton and Dr. Lofton talked about and described. And I'm kind of specifically concerned with the context at the University of Arkansas campus, which is a historically and predominantly white institutional space. Yes, Molly, you have your hand up. Is it for me?
No, I'm so sorry. It's left over
Okay.
from transitioning. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let me be transparent. For me, conversations on race are social justice conversations. By this, I mean honest and authentic data-driven conversations about racial structures and power, institutional and organizational privileges, and marginalization and oppression, all of the things that Drs. Banton and Lofton talked about. Let me also mention that as I developed my pedagogy around such conversations, I grappled with the same question. Should I create safe spaces or brave spaces for my students? So let's begin by defining safe. According to the Webster's dictionary, safe, I quote, means not likely to be harmed, protected from, or not exposed to danger and risk. The question is, how can we have safe conversations around race, right? While the exact origin of the safe space concept is unknown, some trace it back to the 1960s women's movement and the need to create violence-free protected spaces and to provide a community to enact changes. In education, in recognition of trauma surrounding gender and violence, especially sexual violence, feminist scholars emphasized safety. They wanted to protect survivors of gendered and sexual violence from being re-traumatized. In education in general, the notion of safe classroom space became popular at the end of the 1990s in the context of multicultural education. It was used to denote an environment where everyone feels comfortable expressing themselves and participating fully without fear or ridicule. Over time, however, a safe classroom environment became conflated with one where learners feel physically, emotionally, and socially comfortable. In this context, before I transition to speaking about brave spaces, let me stop and pose a question that I grappled with as a feminist scholar. Safe classroom for whom? And Molly, next slide, please. So let me unpack the concept of safe in the context of race-related conversations in a historically white context. And more specifically, as a sociologist, I always must ask, whose practices, whose identities, and whose experiences define our classroom spaces? I looked at the Sam Walton College statistics and learned that out of 205 faculty this very spring, 119 identify as white, 5 identify as Black African American, and 1 as Latino. 131 undergraduate students identify as African American or Black, which is about 2.6 of the student body in the college, undergraduate, right? Now, these statistics are vital because they show whose racial perspective is likely to define safety and whose safety is likely to be at the center of traditional educational practices. Given this, I propose that in such context, the expectation of safety could be seen as actually reproducing racial privilege. So, since my teaching practices have always been organized, and again, I'm very transparent, around social justice principles, I recognize the expectation of safety is contradictory and complicated. When it comes to race, I believe it is my responsibility to center and consider how the underrepresented and marginalized students may experience conversations about race. And may I have next slide, please? Which takes me to the notion of brave spaces. This term was apparently coined by Arao and Clemens, who in a 2013 article argued that meaningful conversations about race, racial diversity, etc., are primarily social justice conversations, and such conversations require taking risks. For students whose identities and experiences are the norm, the risks are often related to learning about unearned privilege, whiteness, wealth, the myth of meritocracy, and related concepts that both Dr. Banton and Dr. Lofton talked about. For students whose experiences and identities have been marginalized, the risk is typically related to experiencing microaggressions, for instance, from their peers, and sometimes even from faculty in the classroom. And one such microaggression is asking our underrepresented students to educate other students, typically white students, about their experiences. I'm gonna say that that's an example of microaggression. However, and this is critical, microaggressions, including invalidations and hidden insults, cannot be tolerated in brave spaces, regardless of who appears to be present. So it's like a gay joke type of a situation. We do not know if there is a gay person in the room. Are we going to say that we are going to oppose or challenge or have an ouch moment when we know, when somebody says a gay joke, only when we know that a gay person is present? Or are we going to do this, challenge the joke, regardless of who we know is present? Which of those two actions are actually more transformatory and transformative in their transformatory and transformative? So it also means that although there appears to be a growing sense of urgency about race-related conversations, and we kind of touched upon this a little bit, I have to ask myself and be vigilant around the two questions. How long have these conversations been urgent for people of color? How long have they been urgent for marginalized people of color, right? And am I intentional and prepared to lead and facilitate these conversations? Because again, what it means for me, for instance, as an instructor, is that I must center in the epistemological sense the histories, knowledges, and experiences coming from the historically marginalized communities and peoples. And this is really regardless of who is in the classroom, right? I cannot rely on underrepresented students to represent the experience, because their experience does not exist in my mind. There are experiences related at the intersection of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, social class. I cannot do it. So I need to center the epistemology, the knowledges of people of color, underrepresented students. And I use a few strategies to accomplish this, which include validation, define my own positionality, and building trust. And I'll be happy to elaborate on those later. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna. I would love to start with Molly Jensen's question. Molly, if you'll come off mute, and I'm going to now that I'm back to the screen, I can lower my hand. And if anyone else wants to throw a question in the chat or raise your hand, I'll be looking for that. And I'm also going to put the slides that we just discussed in the chat so you can have those. So Molly, I'd love to have you pose your question.
Sure. Thank you guys so much, all three of you, for participating. Yeah, so I guess all of you in some ways answered my question in a variety of ways. And it feels as if, you know, just to recap, so currently I have a senior level class with 25 students, one BIPOC student, actually maybe two, one Black student, and then maybe one Latina or Latino. It's hard to, I don't know for a fact. But it's a class on nonprofits. So we speak about social justice and particularly economic issues, right? And poverty in the United States pretty extensively. But I think Anna, really a lot of your framework helps me understand that really it's about, and Barbara, you brought this up as well. It's about, if you're going to have that conversation, you better come prepared and have done your homework. And so it's kind of making me realize very often these conversations are organic in nature because of the topic of my class. And so it's making me realize that maybe I need to start the semester fairly early with me having a prepared conversation at the very beginning of the semester, so that when the later conversations come up that are more organic, we have something to refer to. So yeah, thanks for the extra work. Appreciate it much. No, I'm just kidding. But no, I think it's a really great point. And I appreciate the perspective of brave spaces. I'm not afraid to have the conversations at all. And I'm certainly not afraid to make my white students feel uncomfortable about looking at where they've come from and their perspective on the world. I just always want to be sensitive to those students. You know, like my one student, I don't want her to feel like she has to represent, you know, people of color, women of color, I don't want any student for that matter to feel like they have to represent and also tell their story, but it becomes a little more cumbersome and uncomfortable when you have students who are visible minorities, right? So it just becomes awkward. And so I just appreciate everything. And Barbara, I look forward to your resources, but I also, my big takeaway, I think, is to start the semester with a well-researched on my part conversation with the class, since we do touch on it so much. So, so yeah, thank you. I don't know if you guys want to add anything. I feel like I'm kind of stumbling through this, but thank you, appreciate it.
Molly, one of the things you may want to do in your class is find out where their interest is within any marginalized group. And they may not have a reference point. That's why it's important for you to do the background, so you can give them certain ideas that represent their interest. And it could be indirectly, but it will give the student a starting point.
Yeah, that's a great point. You know, because we work so much and the topic is about nonprofits, of course, underserved populations are very often the recipients of the nonprofit work, right? So these conversations tend to come up. And I really like that point, Barbara, because I think often we conflate race and poverty, and they are not, you know, that we see them go hand in hand, but it's not necessarily the same thing. And so students conflate that as well, and then they add additional attributes to that. So yeah, I think taking kind of a poll of what they're interested in, of course they don't know is the problem, but just asking them, I think that's a really good point, because it gives me a place to start the conversation. So yeah, I appreciate all the thought-provoking ideas you guys supplied.
And I believe Anna has a comment here.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to thank you, Molly, for asking the question and talking about this. I think that it's very important that we actually are transparent about how we are going to guide our conversations, classroom conversations. So I think that when you kind of say that, kind of define some things at the beginning of the semester, I think it's an excellent idea. I also think that it's very important to define, to make a distinction between safe places and brave places or spaces, and then also say why you're doing it, right? Why it is that I need to set some guidelines perhaps, but also kind of be transparent about, you know, why we are doing this, what is underlying our, you know, our conversations about race, and why we are, and how we are going to have those conversations. I think that transparency is really critical.
Yeah, thank you.
And again, if anyone else has a question, you can raise your hand or put it in the chat. I would love to know, I feel like we've been right on the edge of really gaining some specific strategies, and I love that. That's been it gives us a starting point for moving forward. I'd love to know if any of the three of you have a specific strategy that you would recommend to us to help us step into this perspective in the classroom. My thought is that we have so much content we need to cover, and we want to, you know, make sure that we have a good way to move forward and bring this conversation in light of that content.
Well, Molly, okay, since I'm in the business college, I kind of get it. I know what you're talking about. But there's a good way to, let's say, I know you do consumer research, right? Is that?
Yes.
Okay. So let's say you're doing consumer research and the students talk about everybody except minority groups. That should be very important. So because when we're marketing to particular people, they want to see things that look like them, or they're looking for something in particular. So how receptive are they to that research? So sending students down that path to look at minority research in the area of marketing can be extremely valuable. I had a student who went out and got a job at Amazon, and in the onboarding process, he was not taught how to deal with multiple generations or other minorities. Luckily, he had my class, Intro to Diversity in the Workplace, and he took some of the skills that he learned there and incorporated it into what he was doing for Amazon. But if we don't introduce the skills here, we can't be guaranteed that they'll know in the workplace.
Excellent. Thank you, Barbara. And Anna?
So in terms of strategies, so you know, I think it's kind of easier for me to talk about strategies as, you know, teaching race, class, and gender always, right? It's like, you know, it's like the Black History Month or Women's Month, right? I mean, these are pieces of American history. These are pieces of global history. We cannot limit those things to 1 month or one specific topic, because I think, you know, maybe it's better than nothing, but how good is it if we are not doing this consistently? So this is how I try to do it, and this is how I developed my classes. Perhaps it's easier because I actually teach about those issues. But when I teach about, let's say, poverty, when I teach about social inequalities, you know, I'm also very aware, or kind of political economy types of courses, I'm always very aware that we have a lot of archetypes, stereotypes, ideologies about people of color. And I think that there is a very fine line between kind of exploding some of those stereotypes by talking about Black economy, by talking about Black people who have been inventors, right? Black people who achieved something that is typically negated in the kind of typical conversations, right? This is not part of our conversations. I think that it's very important to talk about inequalities and class inequalities within the African American population, gender inequalities. It's like we talk about those inequalities for white people. Why cannot we be historically adequate and talk about those inequalities as well? And I know that it's a very precarious subject, because on the other hand, I don't want to create a perception to say, well, we had a black president, hence we don't have an issue. So there is also a very important how we kind of frame it. But I think, again, to kind of pigeonhole one population as being just poor, it really does disservice to everybody else, including the white students, who then think, well, if I think poor, I think black.
That's an excellent point that Anna brought up about the historical context. When we're teaching from probably 1/4 of the history, but when you bring in the other dimensions, it actually changes the contents of the course. So when you start talking, if you talk about the Japanese internment camps and what happened, not necessarily what happened in the internment camp, but what did Japanese people do when they got here? How did they contribute to the economy? Very important information. And in that process, we can explain why, like if you go to Chicago, you got a Hispanic community, you got a Russian community, you got a Jewish community. It's the most segregated place in the world. But because people see themselves in their own community, they feel comfortable staying in their own community because they know the outer part of that community is not going to reflect anything like them. So it's important that we show that history of how the role that everybody played, not just one group.
And I think if we look at,
I said something to reset up.
well, it looks like we have our most special guest on camera now. Thank you, Cree. It seems
I'm
like
sorry.
what we're saying is, as Molly Jensen summarized, to really hit the first day strong in laying the expectations for the environment that we'll have, and then to try and capitalize on every opportunity we have throughout the semester to use examples and reference points that are beyond the comfort zone we might be occupying. I have another question, if no one else has one, which is, if each of you, Cree, I'll start with you, if that's okay. If each of you could give us one recommendation of a podcast, book, resource that you really think might be useful, whether it's a teaching related strategy or just building up our knowledge base, I would love to hear it. Top choice.
You're muted.
Sorry. I would say for me, White Rage is one of those texts. I could, cite a whole bunch, ranging from Eric Williams's Capitalism and Slavery, and the whole gamut of racial capitalism studies now that is out there. It's now a sexy topic for historians. But I would say White Rage, right? Which I think is very readable. We had Carol Anderson here a couple years ago, and I say that because I think it's not only is it readable, but it connects to the kinds of everyday realities that put the stark injustice of practices that we would consider to be polite. We get to trace the violence of those practices. in White Rage, right? So the kinds of legislative and judicial enactments that disproportionately affects Black people and people of color, that fuels inequality, segregation, that prevent Black and people of color from accessing their human rights. And the ways in which I think sometimes um, we don't tend to look at those kinds of things because we see Black life as disposable and gambleable, right? And and we do that in the ways sometimes when we talk about whiteness, and whiteness come to represent all people. So White Rage for me would be one of those texts that would put some flesh onto some of these things that business students have to confront.
Thank you. And Anna?
Okay, so I would say White Fragility would be by Robin DiAngelo would be one. Mediocre by Oyema Oluyo. And I'm gonna also say perhaps Jim Crow and it's Mass Incarceration and the New Jim Crow by Alexander. It's an excellent book that kind of really talks about the economic effects of racial inequality today as we speak. I also wanted to maybe mention one thing, or maybe a couple short comments. There are excellent resources regarding the examples that we use in classes. Mm-hmm. And I know that in business college, there is a lot of exercises that include problem solving. And I think that, I try to be very conscious and aware that when I provide a problem for students to solve, whose students' experiences are actually reflected in those examples. And this is true in engineering, this is true in natural sciences, and it is true in business. So this is something that and in sociology as well. So I think that I'm really sensitive to whose example, whose experience is the example of it. And another strategy that I use, perhaps in smaller classes, is having students to write things, very structured questions, and especially before those very difficult conversations, I ask students to actually put something in writing. And then, whether it's, in the chat or whatever, however they submit it. And then, I guide the conversation from there, which also helps me to be prepared and makes everything safer for everybody, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you. And Barbara?
A couple of things I would recommend is The Color of Law. It's quite interesting. I know we used So You Want to Talk About Race last year in our series. Very easy read, good examples if you're looking for information to incorporate in class. But most importantly, I would go back to PBS, Public Broadcast TV. Examples. And some of these examples you can get on YouTube in short form. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is case studies. And I know we use them, but why do they always have to be the same kind? Why can't there be case studies where students have to think about other people from other walks of life? And then TED Talks. I'm a big proponent of TED Talks. And go back and see, today we are a society where we can go back 1 year and pull a video up from, Demand on TV or something, one of those streaming channels. Mm-hmm. Use what we have at our hands in technology. And then the library has a really, really, really good collection of ethnic videos that can give you a lot of information fast.
Well, I'd like to say thank you to each of you for joining us today, our guests, Cree, Barbara, Anna, everyone that took time to join in. I will say that when we first thought about doing a lunch and learn on this, our concern was how do you even begin to talk about these things in a 60-minute span of time? But if we don't start at least attempting it, that longer conversation will never take place. So thank you for giving us so much to think about and some great resources. And Barbara, we look forward to what you're building in Walton. And I appreciate all of you. I hope you have a great Friday. Thank you.
You're welcome. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you for joining us.